I want to welcome everybody. I'm Don Boozer. I am the coordinator of the Ohio Center for the Book and also the manager of the literature department here at Cleveland Public Library, where the center is based. I'd like to introduce John Derf Backderf. He grew up in Richfield, Ohio, halfway between Akron and Cleveland. He's known for the long-running comic strip The City, as well as long-form works Punk Rock and Trailer Parks, My Friend Dahmer, and Trashed. And he has won numerous awards and accolades for these works, including a prize at the 2014 Angoulême International Comics Festival in France. His most recent work, and the one we're here to talk about today, is Kent State, Four Dead in Ohio, published last year and coinciding with the 50th commemoration of the shootings at Kent State University. Kent State, Four Dead in Ohio has been called a masterpiece of historical cartooning by the blog Please Kill Me, and the work has been named a best book of 2020 by the New York Times, Forbes, NPR, and others. It also won a 2021 Alex Award from the Young Adult Library Services Association of the American Library Association for books written for adults that have special appeal to young adults. And personally, I think that Kent State's going to become a mandatory reading. It's accessible, it's researched in detail, and I think that it's going to be one of those books that everybody recommends to really understand the events that led up to May 4th, 1970, as well as the legacy of those events for our contemporary time. So without any further ado, Derf.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much. One thing I want to do before we get started, I think that it was so poignant in various things I read, but also in your book too, of course, is that the entire shooting took place in 13 seconds. I think that's such a poignant number. And what I would like to do with everybody's allowance is to actually have 13 seconds of silence just to get an idea of how long that actually is when those 67 shots rang out. So 13 seconds. That's it. All that carnage took place in 13 seconds. It's just absolutely
what happens when you fire 67 bullets into a parking lot full of 500 students.
Oh my heavens, it's just amazing. And it's like that's more than 5 shots every second. So it was just amazing. I did think it was interesting too that you mentioned that the Kent State Center itself didn't open until 2012. So it was a long time before Kent really came to grips with what actually happened on their campus.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. For years, they tried to bury it, literally. I mean, they built a gym over half of the site.
Wow.
And they tried to obliterate the rest of it. Well, I mean, it profoundly affected the university. I mean, it really stopped it dead in its tracks for probably 25 years. Enrollment dropped, donations dropped. I mean, it really tarnished the reputation of the university unfairly because,
right.
I mean, the university was as much a victim in this as the students themselves were. Though, I mean, mistakes were made, but
right.
They were not, they were not the perpetrators of the massacre.
Exactly. Well,
now they've embraced it. So
exactly. And you even
talk about, it's a very moving place to go. If you have the chance, I would recommend it. Not just the May 4th Center, but the site itself, which is now a National Historic Site.
Yeah.
Just walking those places and taking the steps down and standing over where the students fell. I mean, it's incredibly moving.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, that sort of brings me to I was interested to ask you, why Kent State? What drew you to spend several years of your life researching and creating the pages? What drew you to that story?
Well, this is a story I've carried with me most of my life, literally. I was only 10 years old in 1970. But I was growing up in Richfield, which is where that same guard unit was the week before the Kent State Massacre. They were sent in by Governor Rhodes to crush a Teamster strike that was taking place there. And they camped right across the street from my elementary school.
Oh, wow.
So there were the tents, the trucks, the Jeeps, the soldiers, and they lined the main street through Richfield, which is Brecksville Road, near the truck depots, bayonets out, facing off against these Teamsters who, as you can probably imagine, were a little bit pissed off that the National Guard was helping to break up their strike. And, these were badass dudes. I mean, you didn't mess around with the Teamsters. But they were also my neighbors. Most of them lived in Richfield. I mean, my school was full of Teamster kids. So you can imagine what the attitude was like in Richfield. It really shook me. And I know that when the school buses drove by where the Guard was deployed, the bus drivers made the kids lie on the floor of the bus.
Wow.
So, this really affects a 10-year-old kid trying to process all this. And it really sparked something in me, some kind of intellectual growth that it led to, everybody has that first kind of shove into the outside world, and that was mine. And so I've carried this story with me ever since, especially, knowing what happened afterwards. And I was also an Akron Beacon Journal paper boy. So I actually delivered those papers, for Dad in Ohio. And yeah, it really affected me. And it's just great history. I mean, it's incredible history. And I felt it was an opportunity because it's not history that's really, it's been told a lot, but not a lot in visual form. So there was an opportunity there, I thought. And, I decided to go for it.
I definitely agree. I was curious to ask you too, what do you think that the medium of comics itself brings to a story like this rather than just prose or even photography or film? What do you think is special about that particular medium?
Well, film has not really been done. I mean, there was one bad TV movie made, and I think it was 1980, but otherwise nothing. The photography, of course, is iconic. On May 4, on the other 3 days, not so much, because those events took place at night. And the photo technology of the day just didn't allow for, really good photography at night. I mean, we just didn't have that power at that time. It's not like holding up a cell phone camera now and taking these amazing photos. That you had to have film, a big rig, lights. I mean, it just wasn't possible. And visual narrative, that's really never been done. And photography is not really narrative. You're capturing a particular moment, but you're not showing, I mean, you can show a sequence, but you're not showing a long story or an entire scene in a narrative form. I mean, it's a different art form. So that's not any slag against photography. Don't get me wrong. I don't want any Kent State photographers jumping down my shirt, but that's just what my art form can bring to this story.
Yeah, I think that the sequential story, the sequential impact that you can have, I think is one of the real strengths of comics. I mean, which brings me to ask you: do you have any dog in the race for comics, graphic novel, some other term? Do you have?
Oh, I don't care. Yeah, comics. That's fine. Yeah, I'm not. I don't embrace lofty terms.
Very good. I was curious when you start the book out, and I think it's very interesting that here's I think it's interesting to take a look. So there's the cover, everybody. For those of you who have yet to read it, you really should. And then on the front we have the National Guard. On the back we have the students. But if you take off the slip cover, which I think is interesting, you have the students on the front, and you have the National Guard on the back. So I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition between those two communities of people that were involved in all this, just within the cover itself. And after your personal reflections in that, at the very beginning, the very first image that we see is that bell tolling on the campus. That's the very first one. Why did you feel it was important to start with that particular image,
Well,
out of all the other ones?
Right. That was the central point of this 4-day event. Everything revolved around that bell, which is still there. It's called the Victory Bell, and the Commons, which is that open green area in the center of Kent State's campus. It's lovely. It's kind of like a bowl surrounded by this low hill and buildings. So it almost had the effect of being like an arena during this protest, because the hillside was lined with students, thousands of them. And then the guard and this small group of protesters, maybe 300 around the bell. And the book is laid out chronologically, so that was the logical place to start, right there when that first just very mild protest, they buried a copy of the Constitution, and that was it on a Friday afternoon. And that was a good place to start. And then tensions escalate as the day goes on.
One thing that I think you do a really good job in the book of is portraying all sides as human beings. I think it's interesting that you not only give people's names when you introduce them, but you give them their ages too, to put all that sort of stuff in context. And I think that you, the students, the National Guard troops, the local government and university officials, even the townspeople, they're all portrayed as very human. And it's so shocking, I think, to see the different perspectives that each of them had on each other, that just the misunderstandings and everything that went through that. And I think one of the things that I pulled out was on page 100, you have one of the National Guard troops saying, "I've never been this scared in my life," which really humanizes, I think, the National Guard. But then Allison says a little bit later on page 152, "Those horrible masks, they look like monsters." And so it's those two different perspectives just of those two communities, I think, is you do a really good job of really portraying them as human beings and not just having it a one-side conversation.
Well, those are both direct quotes too. Obviously recounted elsewhere, but I mean, that's actual quotes. It's sourced in the back. The premise of the book is that I tell it through the eyes and the experiences entirely. Through the eyes and the experiences of 5 people, the 4 kids who were shot and 1 guardsman. And so the reader is actually put on the ground with these 5 people, and we walk through these 4 days with them, right beside them, and we see what they see and we experience what they experience, right up until the moment when bullets start to fly. And I felt that that would really humanize this story. And because when you make it about people, that's where you find both the humanity of it and also the emotional power of the story. And when these, I mean, we know the ending, so I'm not giving anything away. But when these kids are cut down, it's a gut punch. I mean, the back of this book packs a wallop. So that was my premise from the start.
I could not agree more. That's one of the things that's starting to read the book, and the people are introduced, and they're going to class and they're, having their opinions, they're playing the drums and all this kind of thing. And what's going to happen to them. But even knowing that, at the end, gut punch is about the best way that I can describe what you feel. It really was an emotional reaction.
Yeah, I don't spare anything at the end, which is another thing that my art form can do, and this is an odd thing to brag about, but those images, a lot of the images in this book don't exist anywhere else because there were no photos of that particular. I mean, there's so many great photos from May 4, but not, once the bullets started flying, the photographers very wisely hit the dirt. And so there's nothing until a few minutes later, and then we see the carnage. And what I'm able to do is fill in that gap based on accounts, based on morgue reports, based on medical reports, all of the material I had at my disposal. And I thought that was important because afterwards, and we see a little of this today, with the BLM protests, Black Lives Splatter and that kind of nonsense, especially in 1970, because it was just so, tensions were so high. The most common reaction from Middle America was, well, we should have shot 1,000 of them, and we should have shot them all. I mean, you even had parents saying that to their own kids. I interviewed people like that. We should have shot you all. And it's like, well, okay, you believe that? Here's what it looks like. Here's what it looks like when copper jacketed bullets over an inch long go tearing through a parking lot full of students. Fired from guns so powerful they can pump one of those bullets clean through a foot-thick tree trunk and still kill the person standing behind it. This is what it looks like. And, you know, that's why that book is so powerful at the end. And that's why I ended it right there, because I wanted that to be the walk-off. So you just kind of sit there and go, holy crap, and then close the book.
Exactly. Oh, and I think that you bring up a really good point, because I think, you know, reading something like that, say in a prose history, and, you know, 4 students were shot, and they might give some details and things like that, but to viscerally see what that means and see what that looks like, it's extremely powerful.
Especially after you get to know these kids.
Exactly.
And, you know, you've got 280, 270 pages before we even get to the shootings. And we've learned all about these kids, their hopes, their dreams, their fears, how they interact with each other, how they move through their day. And they're remarkable kids, you know, and very typical kids. And I mean, they're kids like, you know, my kids are in college right now.
Yeah, mine too.
So you can really, I think, you know, you place yourself right there with them, and yeah, it has a lot of emotional power.
Speaking of the you don't back off on showing the violence of the situation. I was really surprised, and I was not aware of it before, of the use of the bayonets before the shootings and stuff, and that was sort of the precursor to that happening, and that just blew me away.
Yeah, you always think of bayonets as just like being a little prick, you know, a poke. But these things are actually, I can show you.
Visual aids.
Because there is one.
Yep.
I used it to draw. And this thing is razor sharp, and it is a fearsome weapon. If I had this on the end of a gun, I could shove it right through that wall. And yeah, some of these kids were bayoneted very severely over the course of that weekend. This is a killing weapon. This is not a deterrent. Yeah, and that's the other problem, is the Guard was really poorly equipped. They've had very little in the way of crowd control, you know, weaponry. They had some gas, but that's about it. And they had almost no training in crowd control. And I mean, they were combat troops. They were sent to boot camp. They were trained to fight and kill. And they were sent against unarmed students. It was madness.
Yeah, even sending them against the Teamsters and that sort of thing is, you know, just sort of a surprising sort of, I mean, you know.
Well, except the Teamsters were armed.
That's a good point.
I mean, I don't think for a minute those guys weren't all khaki. But yeah, the students were completely unarmed. And, you know, the Guard was carrying M1s, for Christ's sake, and shotguns. And it was crazy.
And having come directly from the Teamsters stuff, and where you went to school, coming into an unarmed group of students, you can see, you laid out really well that, you know, they were heightened, they were alert, they were, you know, ready for anything. And just the whole ideas of the conspiracy theories that ran around about, you know, there being communists and there being caches of weapons and caches of bombs and all this sort of thing, that, I mean, like you said, the one person's quoted as being, you know, he's never been that scared in his life. And that's coming from a National Guardsman.
They were weekend warriors, you know, the classic, it's not entirely fair. I mean, they did have exercises, they did have training, but I mean, these were not full-time soldiers. They were just trying to stay out of Vietnam and make a little money on the side. And, you know, it was a pretty sweet gig for the era. But to be put in a situation like this with a really just breathtaking incompetence in their leadership, from the governor to the generals, right down to, you know, the lieutenants and the sergeants who were calling the shots on the field. It's just one mistake after another. It's just this runaway train. And, you know, there are points in the book where you just want to scream, you know, somebody make a right decision here, and they don't. And the result is a massacre.
Yeah, it's just I thought sort of going back to the National Guard too. I thought it was interesting with Frank Karlovich. Getting his perspective from inside the National Guard, I thought was interesting. I thought he had sort of a, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it seemed like a sort of an evolution from, that he was just sort of, doing his job in the Guard, to at the very end, he says, if the officer hadn't grabbed his rifle, he would have emptied his clip.
Yeah. Karlovic was a bit of a hard ass. His account is it's very it's very honest, and he makes no excuses. He makes no bones about it. I think he believes he's coming across a little better than he does, but I appreciate the honesty, and it's a great account, and I was happy to have it. I think it's important to have that perspective, not as a counter necessarily, just I was interested in the experience of what these guys were going through, which was so much different than what the students were going through. And I think it's a really interesting part of the story.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think it comes back to that whole thing where you wanted to humanize all the communities that were involved in there, that these weren't, cut out figures that were just going through motions. These are people with, real emotions and fears, and a heightened sense of duty, and all that sort of thing. And it's the whole thing.
Well, Karlovic certainly was. I mean, there were also some thugs. I mean, let's not make any bones about it. There was a group of them in G Troop who did most of the damage, and those guys were just out of control psychos most of the weekend, and they got away with murder. I mean, it's there's no other way to put it. And the other guardsmen are none too fond of them either. One of the guardsmen I interviewed for this book said, those bastards dragged the rest of us under the bus with them. And so, I mean, there was as much differences in the Guard as there were in the student body as well, because the perception is that Kent State was this radical hotbed, which is complete nonsense. Kent State was actually a fairly conservative student body, even by Ohio standards. I mean, Ohio State was far more politically active than Kent State was. So was Ohio University. But you have these perceptions, and perceptions are not always reality. So that's the job of a historian.
And you bring up the fact in the book about that Ohio State was almost a precipitating event for sending in the National Guard and overreacting by the governor and all those sorts of situations.
Yeah, I mean, the Guard force that the incidents at Ohio State happened a few days before Kent State, and the Guard was sent into Ohio State, and I think 3,000 guardsmen. I mean, at Kent State it was 1,200. And it was to stamp out something that's known at Ohio State as the 6-hour war, which was basically a day-long fire skirmish all over campus it was just a complete chaos, spilled into the surrounding neighborhoods. Yeah, it was something. So, yeah, there were a lot of moving parts to this story, but, I tried to stay focused on that narrative in those five lives, because you don't want to go too wide, because then you lose the emotional power.
No, I think you did a really good job of you'll insert sort of the pages of information about particular tangents and things like that, and then right back to the storyline to get the personal lives and that sort of thing. I think you did a great job with that.
Thank you.
That was impressive. You in your notes and your acknowledgments, you talk a lot about the people and the resources at Kent State University libraries, and I was wondering if you could talk about the role of libraries in your research and the digital access that's available now. No particular reason I'd like you to talk about that.
I can't imagine why. Kent State Libraries is great. They have special collections on the top floor of the main library, which is that big tower in the middle of campus. Which was being constructed, actually. It wasn't yet open in 1970. So it was kind of tricky to figure out how much to build there, in the background, but I managed to find some reference. And they have this massive collection of, oh, geez, everything. Papers and archives and court transcripts and intelligence reports and a lot of oral histories and written histories, which were invaluable. I mean, we're talking 150, maybe 200 of these things of various lengths. And it's just a marvelous resource, and the librarians were thrilled to help me. The May 4 Center is separate. That's in Taylor Hall, and that's kind of a walk-through museum, which has a lot of material as well, and a lot of personal effects, which are incredibly moving to hold and look at, because it's that actual connection to these four that you're looking for. And then there's another archive at Yale, believe it or not, of all places. These are all the materials from the court trials of the 70s, when the parents and the victims of the shootings, the survivors, sued Rhodes in the state of Ohio. And so this is all the material that came from discovery and deposition. The families, after the trial was settled, didn't want that material kept in Ohio because Rhodes is back in power by then. So they sent it to Yale, and that's another huge archive. So, I mean, I really had, was a unique problem, because with some of the other books I've done, the problem was finding the material at all, because a lot of it was, you didn't know where it was. It didn't exist. I mean, it was really a fishing expedition. With this one, there was just this mountain of material, and the problem was digging through all this stuff and finding what I needed. So it was a unique but happy problem.
I thought it was interesting how even in the acknowledgments you talked about the coffee shop and the bookstore at Kent, where you would go to like sort of decompress after. What was it like emotionally to listen to those interviews and look through the mounds of information? How spent were you after a research trip?
Well, it depended on what I was looking at, but yeah, it was it was always, your mind was kind of racing, and I always parked, well, not always, but a lot of times I parked down near Water Street, so I would walk from the library back through the shooting site to get down to where my car was. And then you're thinking about all this, and you're taking it in, and you can almost see the people you've been reading about take shape in front of you. So yeah, I needed some decompression time, definitely.
Wow, I can't even imagine. To maybe lighten it up a little bit, for those of us who are curious about the whole, sort of behind the scenes creative process and things like that, I'm just curious if you could sort of explain, how you work. How do you start to do your research? At what point do you really start to put pencil to paper? How have computers, changed the way you work? I just watched My Friend Dahmer on Hulu last night. That's a chilling story.
Yeah, well, yeah, there it is right there. I just passed it.
Yeah.
So here we are at Kent State, and there's some stuff there, blah, blah, blah. There's some research I wanted to get to. Okay, so here we are. So for this one, I started with a script. I don't always, but it was 2 years of research before I even started to really figure out. I mean, I had the premise. I basically knew the story because I've been following it for years. So, it was sort of clear in my mind, and the research filled it in. And then I just sat down and did a real quick script. And so when I write, this is how I write. These are called roughs or thumbnails. They're just on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, right? And it's just very loose sketch to really, for me, more than anything. There are creators who do several rounds of roughs. They do much more detailed versions than I do, but I think that's a waste of time. So I don't bother. And from there, I go right to a pencil, which is on 11 and a half, 11 by 17 sheets of paper. And it's a fairly detailed pencil. And this is the most time consuming part of the process, because this is where I pour in all that research I do. So, for example, the bottom here, the bottom panel, that's Sandy walking down her, Sandy Scheuer walking down her street. That's actually her street.
Oh,
And
wow.
so those are the houses, and, you know, I put in period cars and period, you know, clothing and all the stuff that I've done. And I had to recreate this town and this campus 50 years ago, which was no easy task. I mean, that's kind of a visual minefield, because Kent has changed so dramatically, as all college towns do and all universities do. But if you look at this pencil and then look at the rough, you can see it.
Yep.
I don't change a lot.
Yep.
And then from there, on a fresh piece of paper, I use a light tablet, which is a big, like a drawing board that glows with a light, so I can see the pencil underneath, and I ink it. And then
So you don't ink directly on the pencil. That's you use a
No.
light table to
Right,
ink on top of that. Okay.
right. So I don't have to spend hours erasing
Good point.
pencil lines. I learned that mistake with actually with my friend Dahmer. And at that point, I scan it into the computer, because everything becomes digital at some point. I could do it earlier. I could create this whole thing in the computer if I wanted to, but I actually like the physical act of drawing. It's just something that gives me pleasure. So I do it that way. And then once it's in the computer with an iPad Pro and an Apple Pencil, then I add the tones. And this is where I would add color, would it have been color. So it's just a very simple 1, 2, 3, 4-step process.
Oh, that's great.
Of course, you have to multiply that by 280 times at every step.
Yeah.
So now here's a 2-page spread, because you have to think in terms of 2 pages together, right? Because you open a book and that's what you see, 2 pages. So this is the rough and then the pencil. And I know it's going to be a night scene, so I know there's going to be some real heavy drawing here. So you go from rough to pencil. And then there's the finish. So this one came together really well.
I noticed the lettering is on your pencil there. At what step in the process do you actually do the lettering?
Well, I do it on the pencil, and then I transfer that to the finish. So because I have to get the word balloons the right size, right? So I have to put in the type to see, make sure I don't have the word balloons too big, it's too small, and I can adjust in the pencil stage. And then when I ink, I can ink the balloons to the proper size. The lettering is a computer font. It's based on some hand lettering I've done using a fontifier. So the nice thing about it is it's editable.
Oh, yeah.
And since I have discovered, much to my horror, that I've lost the ability to correctly spell any word over 2 syllables, this is a handy function to have. My journalism professors would be horrified. Oh, here's an interesting one. I'll just wrap it up with this. This is the iconic photo, of course. Yep. Taken by John Philo, who was a student photographer, won a Pulitzer Prize for it. The Washington Post just wrote about the girl, Marianne Vecchio, who was a teenage runaway who just happened to be passing through Kent and was immortalized, much to her chagrin, in this photo. This is the rough I did, and it's not great. I was having trouble with this. I was having trouble envisioning it, because I just didn't want to replicate this, because I think that's very stiff and lame. I wanted it to be something else. I wanted to try to capture somehow some element of the power of this moment, right? Now, for the rest of the book, I would say the thumbnails, I would say 95% of my roughs wound up as finished pages. I didn't change much. it's gotten to the point where I really conceptualize things very clearly at the beginning. Now with My Friend Dahmer, which was one of my first books, that wasn't the case. That was maybe, I was changing stuff throughout the book and redoing pages, and you don't want to do that, especially with a 280-page book. But now I've gotten to the point where I really conceptualize it. But this is the exception. I just wasn't happy with this. So what I did, I actually worked it out in the pencil phase. It's 3 pages. So this is the two-page spread here. This is the previous page. So it actually starts on the previous page. And what I focus on here is not the image of the girl and Jeff's body, but on the screen. And the visual representation of sound, which is something that is unique to comics. Sound is a visual element. And the reason I did that is because interviewing the survivors, the students who were there, what they all told me was that after the bullet stopped, after those 13 seconds you demonstrated earlier, there was just this heavy silence that seemed to just go on forever. And then suddenly screams from everywhere, all directions, just screams. And I thought that'd be a really great way to, so the scream actually starts here at the bottom of the previous page and then carries over the spine of the book to the top of the final page, and then the narrative continues down. And it turned out pretty well. And that's the way I went with that.
Talk about an understatement.
Yeah.
It turned out pretty well.
So there you go.
Wow.
That's how I put a book together.
Very cool. Thank you so much for that. That's fascinating. I'm trying to think if was there anything that I want to open it up to questions here soon, but was there anything that we didn't cover in our conversation here that you I did sort of again, let's after seeing the screams on the campus of Kent State, I had mentioned before we started today about your popularity in France and the fact that you have won a Angoulême Prize. And I was just curious if you could talk briefly about, how that came about, or, what some of the benefits
French
are being popular in France.
Right. Well, it's France and Belgium, both. Right. Those are the two most fanatical comics fans in the world.
Yeah. And
comics to them are not junk culture as they are in other countries. Well, still in this country. I mean, they don't care about superheroes. They don't. To them, it's a legitimate art form. Right up there with film and literature and music and everything else. They call it the ninth art for some reason. I don't know what the other 8 are, but probably fill in the blanks. And they really hold it in high esteem, as does Belgium, which of course is where Hergé was from, and Tintin and all that. So, I mean, they have a long history with comics, and they buy as many comics as Americans do, but there's only 60 million of them, and there's 350 million of us. So, I mean, the numbers are really staggering. And somehow, I can't explain it either. It's the great surprise of my life, but it's really been amazing. And My Friend Dahmer, I think, which was my breakthrough work, it's been translated. I think I'm up to 17 languages in that one. And Kent State has been it's even in a pandemic year, that's kind of thrown a monkey wrench in everything. Kent State's in, let's see, Dutch, Swedish, Finnish, French, Spanish, and now as I mentioned earlier, before we started, I just found out today is going to be in Catalan, and also Portuguese. So yeah, it's in 7 plus English. That's 8, which isn't bad for all these crazy stories about Ohio, which is what all my books are about. But actually, I've found that the Europeans are fascinated with Ohio, particularly Cleveland, because all my stories are set in Cleveland or Akron.
Right.
And kind of this, bombed out Rust Belt and all its glory, which, I love. I mean, I've lived here my whole life, mostly. And, but the Europeans are very curious about it. They're just fascinated about it. And my first book, which is Punk Rock and Trailer Parks, which is set in Akron, I had someone in Belgium come up to me and after a lecture and ask me, how can the U.S. allow something like Akron to happen? And it's like, I have no explanation for this. I don't know, but they're really fascinated. So yeah, it's a nice benefit.
I remember reading, you had mentioned too, that it's such a different signing things in France and Belgium than it is in the United States, because they expect a whole, I believe it, the dédicace or however it's pronounced.
Yeah, it's a title page drawing. I actually do that here now just because it's a nice thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I've signed, God, probably, geez, over 1,000 books in the US through Max Backs up here in Cleveland Heights, because we have no signings. I mean, it's been really a challenge. So it's all mail order. And I just sign away at them. I just got boxes and boxes of them. You know, it's, yeah, it can take a while though. I mean, when you get a line of 100 people going out a door in a bookstore, you kind of regret doing that. But the drawings get really bad after like number 50. They really go downhill fast.
Oh, that's great.
Now, the research took about 2 years, which was exhaustive. And really, I could have kept on researching this book. I mean,
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, how did you know? I would say when to stop, but how did you know it was time
to have a way of forcing your hand,
focusing your mind?
Exactly. I mean, I knew I was going to need 2 years to draw it because it's some pretty serious drawing and things I've never drawn before, military scenes and soldiers and crowd scenes. I knew it was going to kick my ass, and it did. But so I knew I had to have those 2 years. So at a certain point, you got to stop. Now I kept I kept going. I mean, you know, I never, even though I was drawing, I was still stumbling across material. In fact, I nailed an interview I'd been after with one of Alison Krauss's friends like a week before my deadline, and changed some dialogue because, you know, I just asked her the question I needed to know. It's like, yes. So right up to the end, but I could have kept going. Yeah, no question. I could have used another year in this book easy. I don't know if it would have made it any better, but you know, it was hard to stop. And it was tough because, you know, I'm an outsider. It's not my generation. You know, I came of age a decade later and the world had changed. There was no more draft. There was no more Vietnam War. I didn't even have to register for the draft. Nor did I go to Kent State. I went to Ohio State. So for me, I mean, I could sit down right now, you know, and draw a map of Ohio State in 1982 and probably get 75% of it right just from memory because I lived it. You know, when you have that immersive experience at a university, and that sticks with you. But Kent State, and it was also such a small window in time, you know, these 4 days in May 1970. So I had to hit it just right. And I think for the most part, I got it. You know, it took a long time to get the reference I needed and figure things out. But there was a couple roof lines I got wrong, which I'm kicking myself for. It's like, oh, but you know, it was tricky, very tricky. And the interviews, it took a while to track people down. There's still people that don't want to talk. You know, people have PTSD. People, you have to be very gentle with them. There were quite a few interviews I had where, you know, the interviewees were in tears by the end of it. And, you know, it's just part of what they went through. I mean, they're literally war veterans. So some of these people saw their friends cut down in front of them.
Exactly.
And so there were other people, you know, tracking them down, trying to find them. That some don't want to talk, some do. I mean, it just takes a long time. And like I said, I wish I could have nailed a few more interviews. I wish I could have kept going, but I just couldn't. I had to stop.
Yeah, and I noticed Alan Canfora just died in December, so that's
He
another person
did.
that
He
was very
did.
active.
Yeah,
So,
Alan was very helpful. He was one of the kids who was shot
mhm.
on May 4th. He was friends with some of the other people who were killed. Allison and Jeff, he knew. And he's been an activist for a long time. Kind of a formidable guy. He doesn't suffer fools, and but he was very generous with his time. He was very generous with the material, and he has more than anybody. Or I don't know what's happened to it, but I assume it's going to wind up in an archive somewhere.
Yeah, let's hope it ends up somewhere that can really appreciate it too. Yeah,
Oh, I'm sure it will. I'm sure it'll go to Kent State
exactly.
if they don't have it already.
Right, right. Yeah, one of the things I think that really struck me, you talked about the personal stories and everything, and I just sort of went through and checked on like the final words of each of the people who got shot, and I thought it was so poignant that Sandy talks about the lovely spring morning and smelling the lilacs. Allison says, nothing's going to happen, I won't let it, that sort of thing, to her roommate.
Right.
And then, I thought that Jeff saying the fact that you put the words "and be counted" in the final word balloon of him, I thought was so poignant in the fact that that he's going to be counted, and he's going to be counted among the ones that
Right.
are killed. So it's
Yeah,
just
it came from his roommate. That was really a piece of gold. Yeah, no, it's they all, yeah,
and
they're
they all
all very
did.
powerful finale.
And the fact that you were able to include so many direct quotes and that sort of thing I think is so well done. The book about Gettysburg by Michael Shara, he uses a lot of documentation and that sort of thing. And I always was very impressed by that he was able to spin an interesting narrative. And I think that your book stacks up right along the side those historical fiction sorts of works. So, and I think it's going to
praise. I mean, it is a reconstruction. I mean, I don't say that right in the front of the book. It's a dramatic reconstruction, but it's based on source material. I mean, I really kind of went really down the rabbit hole there. There's 30 pages of footnotes in the back.
Oh, that blew me away. I was reading through it, and I bought it, and then I was reading through it, and I sort of flipped through it, and I come to all the prose notes at the end. I'm like, oh my Lord.
Yeah, it's every page, almost every panel.
Yeah.
Sourced, multiple sources, because journalism degree, I was told, you got to have more than one source. It's not always possible, but I did it where I could. So yeah, no, that's how I was trained to tell stories. I mean, I'm not trying to put myself up as a superior being or anything. The fact is, I'm not smart enough to know any other way to tell stories other than how I was trained at Ohio State, and it's worked well. I mean, I've done it with all my books to some degree. My friend Dahmer had a lot of footnotes in the back too. And my wife helps me. She's a former journalist with a Plain Dealer. So she's a footnotes fiend. So she really held my feet to the flame. But yeah, no, that was a lot of work. 30 pages of footnotes.
I will bet. And I want to say that I think the last image of the blood being washed down the drain is such a poignant way to sort of symbolize the fact of, Kent State tried to forget about it, just wash it away, that sort of thing. But then with the epilogue with Nixon and the very last line of the book being "Remember Kent State" has so many loaded connotations. It's just, that was a perfect way to end the book.
Right. Yeah. That comes from, what's his name, from the Washington Post, the Watergate reporter. God, how can I be blanking on that? It'll come to me in a second. But he had the Nixon Library look for quotes on Kent State on the Watergate tapes.
Oh, wow.
And that's what they came up with. Yeah, it's a chilling scene, especially since Nixon had his fingers in the hands of, he was definitely involved with Kent State. Wow. Even it wasn't on a deep level, but he was, military intelligence was there on campus sending reports back to the Pentagon that weekend. And the CIA was undoubtedly there too, because they were everywhere.
Yep.
So, and the FBI was there in force. So yeah, it was just all layers.
Yeah, and you bring up Terry Norman and taking the photographs and all that sort of thing. That's a tragic figure there.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting aspects of this story, and a lot that aren't known or haven't been told, or haven't been put together. So, you know, and I have the advantage. I mean, there hasn't been. I was surprised, you know, coming into the 50th anniversary like that. I thought there would be this rush of books about Kent State, and there really wasn't.
Right.
There were a couple like University Press books put out. Some of them are really good. There's a photography book put out by one of the student photographers, Howard Ruffner. And then a book put out by the managing editor of the Beacon Journal, Akron Beacon Journal at the time, which won a Pulitzer for their coverage of Kent State. It's really fascinating, well, for me, because inside baseball, you know, that kind of stuff. Yeah, but other than that, there was just not a lot. I was really stunned by that. And most of the books that have been put out, and there's tons of them, were put out in 1971 or 1972. So there's been a lot of revelations since then, and a lot of stuff's been uncovered. We had the court trials, we had some, you know, some later revelations as the technology improved and they were able to look at things again, evidence again. So I had that advantage. I mean, it's not that I'm a superior investigator. It's just that I had the advantage of 50 years of time.
Sure. Well, you have definitely done a service to everyone to help us remember Kent State. I want to thank you so much for being so gracious with your time and for the offer to stop by for this. It was completely unexpected, and I can't thank you enough for doing it. And we will get the video edited and get it up online as soon as we can. And I want to thank everybody for attending. And again, thank you so much for your time and have a great evening.
Yeah, you too.